Well, we are coming towards the end of 1 Thessalonians, the book we've been in all semester. So if you've been with us, we've been journeying through this book. And if you've never read a whole book of the Bible before, you're well on your way, if you've been tracking with us, to moving through a whole book. 1 Thessalonians is probably the clearest, or one of the clearest, books in our Bible about the issue of sex and the issue of the end times, which makes it a must-read for junior high youth groups around the country. But for us too, we covered the section on sex a couple weeks ago. It was actually our most downloaded podcast of the semester, and just FYI. And now we are in the middle. We covered part of it, and now we're going to cover the other half of the part of 1 Thessalonians where he talks about the end times, what it's like at the end of the age. And I just got a question for you before we jump too far in, and that is this. When I say those words, the end times, what comes to mind for you? Different images, fire, movies about destruction, aliens destroying the world, attacking Will Smith, robots attacking the world and Will Smith, viruses that make people into zombies that attack Will Smith. Maybe for some of you, you think of the Left Behind series. Have you read those books? They're a little before you. You were in, I think, elementary school when they came out, so unless, you probably didn't read them, unless someone read them to you as a bedtime story, which I kind of doubt, And then the beast ate the probably did not happen to you. For me, I remember movies that came out in the 70s about people chopping Christians' heads off with guillotines, and they were terrifying, terrifying movies. I don't recommend to you at all, but I don't know what comes to mind for you when you think end times. For some of you, you probably think just Christian movies that talk about it. You think of different readings. You think about people on street corners with sandwich boards screaming the end is near. For many of you, you probably think of kind of scary and crazy things, and you go, I don't want to be one of those scary, crazy people. And so you kind of back away from it. And what I found is when you mention this idea of end times, there's kind of two extremes you can go to. And one is sort of a paranoid preoccupation, and you've got an end times poster on your wall tracking the seven trumpets and whatever, or sort of an indifference and say, I don't want any part of that, and so I'm just going to move the other way, and it never crosses your mind. But the question is, what are we supposed to think about it? Because the reality is the Bible talks a lot about what the end of the age will look like. Probably every book in the New Testament addresses it, if not directly, indirectly, talks about this thing, this idea, and calls us to adjust our life in accordance with it. And so we are meant to live differently because of what's coming. And so the question is, when we think about the end, what should we be thinking about? What kinds of things should be coming to mind for us? And there's a lot we could fill that in with, and we're not going to cover everything, but I want to give you a sentence that'll put you barreling down the right path and that I think accurately unpacks this text tonight. And the sentence is this: concerning the end, we don't know when it's coming, but we know that it's coming, and so we live like it's coming. That's the sentence. I'll say it again. We don't know when it's coming, but we know that it's coming, so we live like it's coming. That's the sentence that kind of unpacks this text. So I want to walk you through that sentence and this text, and hopefully we'll be on the right track with how we perceive these things. But the first part is this. If you missed it, it's this. We don't know when it's coming. And that's really what we see in the first two verses of this section. Paul says in verse 1, now concerning the times and seasons, brothers, you have no need for anything to be written to you. And you read that and you go, the times and seasons of what? Well, if you look at the text before, he was talking about the parousia, the arrival of Jesus Christ on the planet to stop human history as we know it and to usher in a new era. And so he talked about that. We talked about it 2 weeks ago in the preceding text. But now he says, but concerning the timing of that event, he says, we don't need to have a conversation about it. And you go, why? And in verse 2, he gives you the reason why they don't need to talk about the timing. He says, for you yourselves are fully aware that the day of the Lord will come like a thief of the night. He says, so this event's coming, but he goes, but you, honestly, Thessalonians, we don't need to talk about the timing of the event. Why not? Because you are fully aware that that day will come like a thief in the night. And by like a thief in the night, what he means is it will be a surprise. It won't be something you can anticipate or expect. Thieves don't schedule appointments. I don't know if you know that. They know when they're coming, but they don't want you to know when they're coming. I mean, that's thievery 101, you know? You don't call them and say, it's 9 good. You know, you're meant to come when it's not expected. And that's the idea here. And so I love the way he unpacks his text, what he says to them. You got to catch what he's saying. He's like, guys, we don't need to talk about the timing of the end. Why? Because you yourselves are already fully aware that the timing will come like a thief in the night, meaning it will be unexpected. So he says, hey, we don't need to talk about timing. Why? Because you guys already know that you can't know. That's what he says. We don't need to talk about timing. Why not? Because you guys already know that you can't know. You can't know. It'll be a surprise. And now the question is, how do they know that? They know because Paul told them, probably. I mean, Paul's the one who shared the gospel with them. But how does Paul know? I had one of you guys come and ask me that 2 weeks ago. You go, Ben, you're telling us to trust Jesus, but this book is written by Paul. How does Paul know how the end's going to play out? Well, all Paul is doing in this text is quoting Jesus. Matthew chapter 24. Jesus said, concerning the day or the hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. And then later he says, you know what it's like? He says, it's like a thief who comes in the middle of the night. So the Son of Man will come when you do not expect him. And so Paul is just quoting Jesus here. And Peter does the same in 2 Peter, and John does it in Revelation. So Paul, Peter, John, all of them are quoting Jesus when Jesus says, when I show up, you won't know. So nobody knows when. And so it's useless to speculate about it. So we should think about the end, but one thing we shouldn't spend our time thinking about as believers is trying to figure out when exactly that day will occur when Christ arrives and puts an end to human history as we know it. It's useless to speculate about it. So I got to tell you, your first point tonight is we don't know when it's coming, so don't even try to guess. And by saying that, I'm telling you to resist a temptation that's been present in the church for centuries. People love to try to guess. The year 1000, Europe was in turmoil. They're like, we're about to hit a 1000. Maybe the world's going to end. In the 1400s, there was widespread plague and famine, and so people thought this is the end of the world. Later during the Reformation, when there was political turmoil and religious turmoil, people said, man, it's crazy around here. Maybe this is the end. In the 1800s, that's how the Jehovah's Witnesses got started. That's how the Seventh-day Adventists got started. Because guys said, the end is, and they picked a date, and they were wrong. In the 1980s, there was a book that came out that gave you 88 reasons why the Lord is returning in 1988. And then the same guy wrote a sequel the next year of 89 reasons of why he's coming in 89. I kid you not, all right? He was like, I forgot a reason. Sorry, everyone, buy the sequel, all right? And didn't sell as well. I remember when the Gulf War happened. I had a relative come to me and show me the text in Revelation where it says frogs will come up out of the sea. And he said, did you notice some of the U.S. missiles that we're using in the Gulf War are called frog missiles? Here they are. It's a fulfillment of prophecy. This is the end of the world. Year 2000. People are talking about the world's going to end, all right? All our computers are going to stop. So clearly that's in Revelation somewhere that's when Jesus is going to come back. 2012 is the next one, right? And that because you're graduating or is because you got your money on that's when the world's going to end? I don't know. Either way. Let me tell you something. Jesus said you can't know. And so I think one thing we can know for sure about when it's going to be is you can't know. So don't try to guess. We don't know when it's coming. So you go, okay, so we can't know when. Well, what do we know? Well, what we do know is the fact that it is coming, that this day is coming. Now, I've been saying it's coming. You go, what's it? Did you notice in the text in verse 2, Paul calls it the day of the Lord. And that's not a term Paul makes up. Day of the Lord is an ancient concept. It's a concept that's all through the prophets. And the day of the Lord is a day of judgment, where God comes to judge the world in his righteousness against all the wicked that men have perpetrated. And so it is a day of judgment. Now, before we get into the specifics of what this text is saying, I need to say this too. Whenever this comes up in religious circles, people recoil. You can see it. The idea of talking about judgment, that God will judge wickedness and judge evil, and a day will come where we will render an account, that terrifies people, and it turns a lot of people off to religion. They go, I don't want to talk about judgment. Y'all talk about judgment. I don't like judgment. I don't like the idea of being judged. I don't want other people to be judged. And so I don't like that because judgment. And so we get uncomfortable and around judgment. And honestly, I think it's okay to be uncomfortable around judgment. It's a terrifying thing. But I was thinking about it this week And I thought to myself, you know what we fear more than judgment? Is the lack of judgment. What I think is more terrifying to us than a day coming where evil is judged is the idea that maybe that day will never come. That's a more terrifying prospect. Because if there is no justice in the universe, then all we are people bouncing around who are victims to the whims of evil men. And so I read the news today, and they convicted a man who broke into a home and stabbed and beat a husband and then raped and killed his wife and 2 daughters and then burned his house down. And the article under that was about a man who killed a woman after raping her with a machete in front of her 11-year-old daughter. And the article under that showed video footage of a church that was bombed in Baghdad, 51 people killed, and you saw people running out of the church screaming, why? Why? And you look through all this, and you see what we do to each other. And the idea, everything in us, all of us, you hear about that, and you go, that's unjust, that's wrong, judgment should come, justice should come, right should come. And I'm not talking about vengeance, like let's get them. I'm talking about that's wrong, and we feel not just wrong like I don't prefer that or our government laws are against that. We feel like in the universe that's wrong and something should be done. And it would be horrible to conceive of a universe where nothing is. You go, oh, sorry, nothing does. But the reality is our souls cry for justice. Why? Because the universe is meant to have justice. Evil is a parasite. And we cry out for justice, and the reality is justice will come. It will come. But it's a terrifying thing that it comes. It's sort of a mixed bag, honestly. You know what I was thinking about recently is Westerns get this, you know? I mean, what's the basic premise of most Westerns? There's a town that's held captive by the whims of some evil man, right? And everyone is oppressed and everyone is hurt until what? Until the rescuer comes, right? And some guy comes saddling in, and he's not afraid. And everybody else is captive of fear to the whims of an evil man, and this guy comes, and he's always a lawman. And he doesn't come to bring vengeance, he comes to bring justice. But what happens? The minute he brings justice, it's scary. Justice and evil, when they collide, it's ugly. And sometimes people lose their nerve and say, I don't like this is scary. But what happens? You need justice to come sweeping in if the town's ever gonna have peace, if it's ever gonna have joy again. And the good Westerns is he comes and wrecks shop and restores peace. And the reality is, the reason we tell those stories over and over again is because that's our story. The universe rolls on, and the prophets over and over again saw the way nations would oppress nations, men would hurt women, and the prophets would go, God, why? Why all this hurt? Why all this pain? What's going on here? And God tells them, I'm patient, but a day will come when I will judge. And when I do it, it will be with finality. And let's give it a name. It's called the day of the Lord. And he says it's a day of judgment. Obadiah 15 says the day of the Lord is near upon all the nations. As you have done, it shall be done to you. Your deed shall be returned on your own head. It's a day you can't escape. Amos says, therefore says the Lord, the God of hosts, and all the squares there will be wailing, and the vineyards there will be wailing, for I will pass through your midst, says the Lord. Woe to the man who desires the day of the Lord. It is darkness and not light to you, as if a man fled from a lion and a bear met him, or he went into his house and leaned on the wall against the wall, and a serpent bit him. It's a day of destruction. Zephaniah 1 says the sound of the day of the Lord is bitter. The mighty man cries aloud there. It's a day of wrath is that day, a day of distress and anguish, a day of ruin and devastation, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of cloud and thickness, a day of trumpet blast and battle cry against the fortified cities and against the lofty battlements. It's a day where God comes and says, enough. And it's a day of judgment, and it will come. And he will judge. There is no escape. And Paul calls it here a day that is sudden destruction. But the day of the Lord is something you see in Isaiah, Joel, Amos, Zechariah, Zephaniah, Obadiah. You see it everywhere, and you see it all through the New Testament in every single book. That this is a major theme. One day will come where God says enough. And the day of the Lord will come. And in our text, what Paul is pointing out to us is he simply calls it a day of sudden destruction. It will come when you're not expecting it, and it will be a destructive day. And then what he points out in our text in verse 3 is that there will be a clientele that won't see it coming. He says in verse 3, while people are saying there's peace and security, then sudden destruction will come upon them as labor pains come upon a pregnant woman, and there will be no escape. He says, what I want you to see about that day is there will be a clientele that's caught off guard by it. There'll be a constituency of people that are saying peace and safety. Now, what does that mean? Well, there's Old Testament precedent of it. People would say peace and safety. And what that was, it's a way of saying it's all good. And it's people who would look around and they saw that they had money and they saw that they had political stability and they would say, everything's good. And in the prophets, they would say, no, it's not good because injustice is rampant and you're oppressing the poor. But I think what Paul is pointing out here is it wasn't just said in the Old Testament, it was a popular slogan of the Roman Empire's propaganda machine. That when the Roman Empire would expand in those days, they would come to a nation and they would conquer a nation. They'd say, if you let us rule and don't fight back against us, we will bring you pax et securitas. We will bring you peace and safety. We will give you political stability so you can make money. And what happened is when people bought that, they would say peace and security. And what that meant was they were saying, all I need is the right political party in power and enough money in the bank to make me comfortable. And life's good. And he says there's a group of people that's all they care about. Does that sound familiar? Let me get my party in office. Let me get money in the bank to buy what I want. And if I can get those two things, that's all I need. Now, it's right to care about politics. It's right to care about money. But if that's as far as you go, Paul says there's a group of people that they say, that's all I need is just to be comfortable and have money and buy what I want and things are good. And Paul says those people are in trouble because a day is coming where they need to be right with God. And it's interesting, 2 Peter talks about this day, and he calls them scoffers. He says scoffers will say, in these last days, come with their scoffing, and they will say, where is the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all things are continuing as they were from the beginning of creation. And then he says they overlook the fact that the world that then existed was deluged with water and perished. And so the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. Peter says there are people who are saying, day of the Lord? That's a joke. He says there will be people who will have peace and security, and so when you talk about Judgment Day, they'll think that's funny. They'll think you're kind of stupid. And he says they'll scoff, but they've forgotten something. God destroyed the world once, and he'll do it again. And it's interesting, Peter at that moment is just quoting Jesus, Matthew 24. Because Matthew 24, he says, concerning that day or hour, no one knows, for as were in the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. As in those days before the flood, they were eating, drinking, marrying, and giving in marriage until the day Noah entered the ark, and they were unaware until the flood came and swept them away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. And he says, so there'll be a group of people that they won't think about it coming. They're not worried about judgment, and it will be sudden, and it will be destructive for them. But then he says there's this other clientele that won't be surprised. He says in verse 4, but you are not in darkness, brothers, for that day to surprise you like a thief. For you are all children of light, children of day, and we are not of the night or of darkness. Now, I wish we could unpack all the imagery of that because he's picking up imagery that runs through your entire Bible. We don't have time to do that, but he's playing off images of light and darkness. And if you move through the Bible and do this, maybe we'll do it later on the podcast, I don't know. But if you move through it, there's pretty much two ideas he's grabbing that the Bible does all throughout. And it's this. Light, when it talks about being in light or being in the day, it has the twin ideas of illumination, of I know things and see things, and intimacy with God, that I know him personally. And so I know God intimately, and he illuminates some realities about his plan in the universe for me. Darkness carries with it the idea of impurity, like moral impurity, immorality, but it also carries the idea of ignorance, like I don't know what's coming or I don't know the things of God. And so you see Psalm 27 says, the Lord is my light and my salvation. Psalm 82 says about the wicked, they have neither knowledge nor understanding. They walk about in darkness. Proverbs 4 says the path of the righteous is like the light of dawn, which shines brighter and brighter until full day. The way of the wicked is like deep darkness. They don't know over what they stumble. And in Romans 1, where it talks about people who don't know God, it says their foolish hearts are dark. And yet when Jesus comes, all through the Gospel of John, Jesus says, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but I have the light of life. And so you see in Colossians, the great beauty of it is we give thanks to the Father who qualified us to share in the inheritance of the saints of light because he delivered us out of the domain of darkness and transferred us into the kingdom of his beloved Son. So we all dwell in darkness, ignorant of God and immoral in our behavior. And yet God rescues through his son Christ and makes us children of the light, children of the day. And so he says, you are people who've come to know Christ. And so you have the light, you have the day, and so therefore this day won't surprise you. It won't come upon you like a thief. Now the question that comes up there is you go, okay, wait a minute. I can't know the date because it's going to come upon me as a thief, but I'm a child of the day if I know Christ, and so it won't come upon me as a thief. So is it going to come upon me as a thief or not come upon me as a thief? Which is it? What's going on here? Well, what he's explaining to them is, again, something Jesus unpacks in Matthew 24, and the idea is this, what we've said earlier. You can't know when it's coming, but you can know that it's coming. And the reality is, his metaphor is really what locks up this deal. Did you catch the metaphor he uses? He uses the metaphor of labor pains, of labor pains. Can you know when labor pains are coming? No, not really. I mean, you can know kind of, right? But the moment labor is going to start, you don't really know, right? And so they can't tell you. It's not like buying milk and they put the expiration date on there, okay? You don't get pregnant as a woman and they just go, it's 7 o'clock on September 14th, you will go into labor. You don't know. You know a range, but you don't know the exact moment. And so what do? You kind of walk around in a moment of expectation, right? You kind of walk around the house and you don't, you kind of are careful. You maybe go out of the house briefly. You don't take long trips to third world countries, right? I mean, you're kind of waiting, but you don't know the moment it'll come. I could be cooking breakfast. I could be talking to a friend on the phone. I could be going for a walk. I could be doing something, and suddenly I'd go, oh. And then it happens. And so can you know exactly when they're going to hit? No. But can you know that they're going to hit? Yes. And how do you know that? Because when a man and a woman really love each other, they come together and through a magical process, right? She conceives, and what happens? Her belly gets big, right? And because there's a baby in her tummy, right? And so, can you know the exact day labor will come on? No. But can you know that labor's coming? Yes, because your stomach's getting bigger, you're waddling around, and you go, I know there's a range this kid can come, and I know we're somewhere in that range, and so I know, so you don't know the exact day, but you live in a constant state of expectation. And so you don't just wait for labor to kick in and you go, oh, what do we do now? We should find a doctor. No, you've thought about that before. You don't go, I'm in labor, let's pack. You've already packed. You've got the bags by the door. So it hits you by surprise. But it's not a total surprise, you were packed. So is it a surprise? Yes. But is it a surprise? No. Do you get it? That's what he's saying. He's saying it's a surprise, but it's not a surprise. You don't know when exactly it's coming, but you do know that it's coming, and so finally you live like it's coming. Verse 6 says, so then let us not sleep as others do, but let us keep awake and be sober. For those who sleep, sleep at night, and those who get drunk at night. Now, we could spend a lot of time on this too. We don't have time. Let me give it to you this way. He's basically unpacking a metaphor, and let's talk about the physical reality first. The physical reality is this. He's saying people sleep at night, right? Which makes sense. College throws that off a little bit, right? But we all understand in theory, typically normal human beings at nighttime sleep, right? And so he's saying you sleep at night. Now what he's doing is this. He's going to contrast it with being awake and be sober. Nighttime, he's been talking about darkness. Darkness, nighttime, he's talking about you don't know the things of God, you don't know the person of God, you live in darkness. You're not the child of the day. And so the person who doesn't know God is in darkness, and therefore they sleep. And what he means by sleep there is he means you are acting like no judgment's coming. And so you are just unaware. And if you are awake, you just fill your life with distractions. That's getting drunk. And so he is saying, yes, people get drunk at night, but he's also carrying the idea of if you're in the darkness, if you're a child of the dark, you don't know God, he says, then you sleep and you get drunk. You're not aware and awake. You don't know that the day is coming. And all he's doing is trying to unpack Matthew 24. Jesus says in Matthew 24, stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But know this, if the master of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have let his house be broken into. Therefore, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. He says, if someone knew a thief was coming, you'd stay awake. You don't know exactly when he's coming, but you know he's coming, so you're awake. Same with the believer. You don't know when the day of the Lord is coming, but you know it is, and so you live in expectation. The person who does not know this is in the dark, and so they sleep. And he goes on and says, who then is the faithful and wise servant, with whom his master sets over his household to give them food at the proper time? Blessed is the servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. But if that wicked servant says to himself, my master is delayed, and begins to beat his fellow servant and eats and drinks with the drunkards, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, at an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and put him with the hypocrites in a place where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And so Jesus says, if you're a slave and your master leaves, a good slave works with the knowledge of the day the master's coming. A bad slave gets drunk and then pays the price for it later. And what Paul's doing here is he's pulling out those images. If you live in ignorance of the day of the Lord coming, you are in darkness, and so you sleep, you get drunk, you just do whatever you want. He says, but there's a different group of people, and we're not like that. People who've come to know God, we know God hates sin and will judge it, and we know he has appointed a day when he will judge it with finality. We know that. We're children of the day. And so when we know that's coming, we can't live as if it's not. We can't just go, judgment's coming, and then just kind of sleep. End of the world, okay, and then get and just throw ourselves away. He says, no, you stay awake, meaning I'm looking around and I know what's going on in the world. And you stay sober, meaning that you keep your mind sharp because you know it's coming. And so all he's trying to communicate in this is this. We know the end is coming, so we live in accordance with that. We live our lives with that end day in view. That's what he's going for. And so he says in verse 8, but since we belong to the day, let us be sober, having put on the breastplate of faith and love, and for the helmet, the hope of salvation. What he's saying there is this: if we know the end is coming, we have to live like we know that. If we know that's out there, there was a TV show a couple years ago, I guess. I never actually watched it, but I remember watching a commercial that gave the premise. And the premise was some guy got a newspaper, and he, through some mystical, magical, I don't know why, he always got the paper the day before it was actually coming out. So it was like a prophetic newspaper. Does that make sense? And so he would read it and say, so-and-so got murdered. But it was the day before, so they hadn't actually got murdered. And so he's reading this, and he knows this is coming. And because he knew it was coming, he hit this point where he's like, do I read that and go, sucks for them? Or do I read that, and does it change the way I live? And what Paul is saying here is, if you know judgment's coming, it changes the way you live. It changes everything about the way you spend money, the way you spend time, the decisions you make, what you do at night, what you do in the day. It changes everything if you know judgment is coming. It does. So now here's the million-dollar question, and then we're done. What are we supposed to do? If it's supposed to change how we live, how do we stay awake and sober? What does it mean to be that? Are we supposed to build fallout shelters and stockpile bottled water? Is that what it means? Does it mean we get an end times chart on our wall and film a video for the rapture that says, if you're getting this, it's because my clothes are in a pile in my bedroom, I've gone, all right? What are we supposed to do? Paul switches metaphors again. He switches to a military metaphor. Let's put on a breastplate and helmet. He says, what you do is go to war. And you go, okay, so we go to war. We know the end's coming. What do? Are we supposed to kill the infidel? Some religions work out that way. Ours doesn't. And he says, yeah, you put on weapons and you go to war, Christian. If you know the day is coming, you strap up and go to war. You don't pretend like we're in peace. But look what the weaponry is. You put on the breastplate of faith and love, and for a helmet, you put on hope. What's our weapons? Our weapons are faith, hope, and love. Real quickly, hope is a confident expectation that God's going to take care of me.
And so because we know what was in the previous section, that he's going to take us and we will always be with the Lord if we've trusted him. Since we have that hope, we have faith, a confident expectation in him in the future. We trust in the present. We trust him. And so because we trust him to take care of us, it frees us up to love. That is, care about other people. And that's basically how faith, hope, and love work. It's interesting. Colossians 1 says faith and love spring from hope. Hope is the confident expectation of a future idea. I know he's going to take care of me. And so what does that do? It means I trust him now and I love you. I care about the people he cares about. And you see that in that text. You go, okay, I'm supposed to love people. Why? Because judgment is coming, I'm supposed to love people? What if they're a jerk? What if she's mean to me? What if he's a professor and he's very unjust in all his decisions? Verse 9. For God has not destined us for wrath, but to obtain salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ. The reason you're loving, the reason you have hope, is because you have a different destiny. Your destiny is not judgment. He says your destiny is rescue. Rescue through our Lord Jesus Christ, verse 10, who died for us, so that whether we are awake or asleep, we're with him. And what he's saying there is he's talking to the Christian, and he says, when you look at your future, you know judgment's coming, but not for you, because Jesus took it for you. All the wrath of God against sin fell on Jesus on that cross. And so his wrath for your sin was dealt with there if you've put your trust in Christ. And so if you're a Christian, wrath hit Christ on your behalf. And all that's left for you is not wrath, but peace. And whether you are dead or alive, that's what awake or asleep means there. You're going to be with Christ in the end and comfort each other with that. But as you look around the world, you see other people around you. And if the wrath of God on their behalf has not hit the cross, then that wrath lands on them. And that's a terrifying proposition. And so for us, if we know we're okay, when we turn towards the world, we have all the resources we need to love people. That's who we are. That's who we are. So if I could close with some illustrations, I would say this. I remember in college, we were having a conversation about rapists, and I don't really know how it started. But somebody asked me the question, if my sister was raped, would I kill the guy? And I thought, well, I guess that kind of depends. But then I thought, okay, let's entertain this for a minute. What if he did and he's in prison? And I got a chance to go visit him in prison, what would I do? Would I walk up there and spit on his face and say, rotten here, and go to hell, or what would I do? And I remember thinking about that. That really bothered me. I mean, that wasn't just proposition. This is my sister. And I remember thinking in that moment, God hates sin. And God says, vengeance is mine. And the day of the Lord is awful. The day of the Lord, men choke and are cut to pieces. It's a horrible day of judgment. And that guy, either the wrath of God over the sin he's committed will fall on Christ on his behalf, and this horrible sinner will be a testimony to the grace of my Lord Jesus, or that guy will burn in hell. And I thought, those are his two destinations. Either he becomes a miracle story of grace, or he suffers for eternity. And as I thought about that end day, I thought, if I met that guy, Ben's vengeance suddenly seems kind of stupid. I mean, God's is enough. And the idea of him burning in hell is a terrifying thought. I don't want anybody to go there. And so I can be kind. I can be kind to someone who's done me wrong. Now, I can seek justice on this earth, put him in prison, but I can be gentle with him. What do you do with a prof who's a jerk? How does thinking about the end times affect the way you handle a professor who's demonstrably unfair? It's not even a question. He's just wrong. And you sit in class and you go, this is unjust. And everything in you wants to raise your hand, and you think about what you would say to him. You know, have you ever done that where you visualize that moment where you sling out insults in such a way that by the time you're done, it actually physically blows them back against the wall, and you kind of rise up and everyone's like, wow, and you just kind of walk off.
Anyway, you just want to devastate him because he's wrong. What do? You say, well, I could visualize him facing the wrath of Ben or the wrath of Susan or whatever your name is. But it comes off weird. Or you go, either this guy knows my Jesus and all the wrath over the stupid things he's doing fell on my Lord, and my God will deal with him like he deals with his children. He will correct him, he will judge him, and I can speak with him in truth and graciously, but I will be kind. Or this guy does not know Jesus, and God's wrath, not just over being unfair with tests, but his wrath over being a human being who has spurned an almighty God throughout all the years he was graciously given, that man will face eternal punishment. You know what it'll do to think like that? It'll make you peaceful. It'll make you what a Christian's supposed to be, somebody who is loving even of their enemies, even of their enemies. It will make you like Elizabeth Elliot, who saw a tribe of Auca Indians murder her husband. He wanted to share the gospel with them, and they killed him on a beach. And her response was not to try to nuke the beach. Her response was to go and to keep telling them about Jesus until they came to know him. And you can read Elizabeth's books and see her little daughter being held by one of the men who killed her husband. Because Elizabeth knew these people are in the dark. They're asleep. They don't know. And success is not me wreaking havoc on them. It's me putting on a breastplate of love because I have on a helmet of hope. And I move towards them and I'm loving and I'm patient and I'm kind because I want them to be one of the children who are awake and who are alive and who journey into the light with Christ for eternity. And so considering the day of the Lord makes us loving. It makes us loving.